My name is Anna Mariguddi and I'm based in the Faculty of Education at Edge Hill University. I'm going to present about the notion of teacher expertise within an informal learning realm with a particular focus upon the case of Miss Lewis. So I'm going to start my presentation by looking at potential meanings of informal learning, then placing this within the context of music education. I'm then going to introduce my research project and research design under which the case of Miss Lewis features. I'm going to present what I found, followed by a discussion and then a conclusion. So what do we mean by informal learning? Informal learning can be seen as something which is never organised, has no set objective in terms of learning outcomes, and is never intentional from the learner standpoint. It can also be seen as something which is not sequenced beforehand and occurs during self-chosen and voluntary activity. So it's quite haphazard and something which occurs in the moment. Volkstad came up with the idea of a continuum, so informal learning on one end and then formal on the other end, as informal learning can often be understood as something which it is not, which is formal learning. So if you imagine yourself placed on a continuum, you can flip between the informal and the formal depending upon the moment. If we imagine a school situation, it'll be quite hard to do true informal learning, I believe, because schools are organised, they do have set objectives in lessons and set learning outcomes, they are sequenced beforehand, and they're not always self-chosen voluntary activities that we engage with in the school situation. So I think what we mean by informal learning within the school is as far along the continuum as possible towards the informal learning side. So let's put this within the context of music education. So the theoretical framework that I've based my research upon is Professor Lucy Green's theory about how popular musicians learned. So she looked at how popular musicians learned in an informal learning realm, so without the presence of an expert, so largely self-directed learning, and she identified 5 principles about how musicians did this, listed on the side here. So this was in 2002. And she developed this as a potential problem solver for some of the problems in music education, such as the students are bored, they feel alienated by the genre and the lack of choice in them, and also sometimes notation. So lots of formal elements that can be attributed to some of the problems in music education. In 2008, she published about putting these principles into the secondary school environment. So she extracted them from the informal learning environment of popular musicians, and she delivered these in the school situation. So this is what was implemented by the music teachers. She had positive findings, such as student motivation was raised, students were more engaged with musicking, and lots of positive things there. Her research was adopted and heavily promoted by Musical Futures, an organisation which continues to promote informal learning in music education. However, one thing which must be noted here about the research that Lucy conducted in 2002 was that the musicians' musical engagement tended to occur when popular musicians were either solitary or with a community of peers with the absence of an expert. So there were no teachers present often, these were self-taught musicians. So this presents a problem for when we put this theory into the school environment. So this is how it was overcome. So the role of the teacher within this theory was to establish ground rules for behaviour, set the task going at the start, and then stand back and observe what pupils were doing. So it seems like there were formal elements at the beginning of the lesson, but then that's when the informal learning was really kicking in, when the students were allowed to engage with music on their own. However, Alsop identifies that the topic of teacher expertise bumps up against the values of informal learning. And indeed, one potential reason for this is that specialist, powerful, sacred knowledge can be sacrificed on the surface. So the concept of the teacher as the expert kind of vanishes into the background here, and students are seen as the expert. They're making their own choices in who they work with, what music they choose, and they're engaging with it in a way that suits them. So I felt that there was some in-depth knowledge lacking here about how this theory was experienced, and also there were some tensions that arose that I felt that I wanted to find out more about. So this is where my research project comes in. So I wanted to know how this informal learning model was understood, implemented and experienced, particularly in schools, for the purpose of this presentation. I conducted a 3-year study using a qualitative interpretative approach, and I had a joint social constructionist and constructivist epistemology. So here's my research design. I had two phases in my research. The first phase, I conducted interviews with key figures relating to informal learning in music education and the Musical Futures organisation. This was largely to get the background or genesis about the model, how it had developed until the time I was conducting my research. And then importantly for this presentation was the second phase. So I conducted case studies in 4 secondary schools in England. Within these schools, I looked at documents relating to the department. I conducted student and teacher interviews and also observations of music lessons. One of these schools was Redwood School, and this is where Miss Lewis was based. Pseudonyms have been used throughout this research. I analysed my data thematically using an approach advocated by Brown and Clark. So here's Redwood School and Miss Lewis. So it was a mixed gender secondary school, average size, based within the southeast of England, and it was graded as requiring improvement by Ofsted. Miss Lewis herself was a classically trained musician. She learnt the flute in school, although this was largely learnt outside of the school environment with teachers, so private music lessons, and she brought it into the school sometimes, but she did experience some alienation with her teacher. The flute wasn't regarded as something which was particularly popular in her school, and she didn't really want it to be associated with some students who were affiliated with the orchestra and band. She wanted to be separate from all of that. She has implemented musical features since 2015, so relatively new considering the approach has been around much longer than that. She attended a limited number of musical feature training sessions prior to the research, although she recalled no direct engagement with Green's work. So she said she hadn't read her research or her books personally. She was familiar with informal learning by talking to other teachers who were implementing it, by engaging with musical feature training, and she couldn't list the principles exactly, although she was really sure, and her perception was that she was absolutely implementing informal learning, and she felt very strongly about this. So here is what I found. Miss Lewis explicitly projected an identity as a non-expert within the classroom. She was really happy to expose her gaps in knowledge of musical instruments, genres and technology. So this is what she said. And she uses the term musical features interchangeably with informal learning, but after talking to her, she meant informal learning by musical features and vice versa. This was all one concept for her. So she said, I find with musical features, I engage much more in the skills that I find threatening. I speak more confidently about music because I feel I'm getting a much better understanding myself through this approach of teaching. So she felt confidently, she wasn't scared of engaging with something that she wasn't sure about. She was no longer staying in the safety net of skills that she was familiar with from her own background. So she was really coming out of her shell with this approach. Miss Lewis was also willing to embrace the musical features ethos of student expertise, as opposed to teacher expertise, and the notion of being able to learn from her students a sense of freedom to be increasingly creative. So she said, before I felt I had to know it, and I was the teacher. Therefore, if I didn't know it, I was being bad. And obviously, you can't know everything, and certainly I'd be happy to say, I'll go away and I'll look that up. So this is something I observed a lot during her lessons. So she would go over to a student, perhaps playing bass guitar, and she'd say, I've never played that instrument before. How do you do this? Or, that's great. Or, can you show me how to do that? And if she wasn't sure about something which a student had asked her, she'd say, please go and look it up and I'd love to learn from you. And she did actually go back and she was really happy to learn from her students about the different instruments, because there were a lot of different instruments being played within her lessons and she was going between them. However, she did note in her interview that pedagogy did not align with some aspects of the wider school ecology. So some examples she gave was the measurement of progress, target setting and assessment. So by her senior leadership team, she was required to put numbers and grades on her students' attainment and progress, but she felt that when they were engaging with informal learning in the classroom, they were making different choices, they were using different instruments of different levels and abilities, and she didn't particularly want to give those ideas numbers because the students were being creative, and she found it really hard to then give this informal learning structure in terms of her reporting back and her accountability. So that's what Miss Lewis's view was about the informal learning experience and how she implemented it. However, on the other side of the coin, we have the students' perceptions of what they experienced about the informal learning. So overall, I found that informal learning pedagogy did not match student expectation of how a teacher should be, according to the students in the school. So I feel that conversation between Jack and Lola really summed up the impression I got from a lot of students and what they were saying about Miss Lewis's pedagogy and the informal learning approach that she was using. She actually stood out negatively in comparison with other teachers at Redwood School. So Jack, everyone says Miss is really weird. Lola, but everyone finds Miss, and she was trying to think of a choice of words here. Most people say they don't really like Miss because she's different to other teachers. She enjoys herself when she's teaching, she gets very into it, and she learns alongside us. Where most other teachers, they know what they're doing, but they don't act like they enjoy it, Jack says. She likes learning new stuff. So if you really break down this quote here, lots of it seemed positive on the face value. So Miss Lewis enjoys herself when she's teaching, she gets into it, she's learning alongside her students, but they see that actually perhaps she doesn't know what she's doing. The other teachers who perhaps I presume implement a formal learning approach just because of the way they're showing this difference between Miss Lewis and the other teachers, they're saying that actually this is really negative. Everything that Miss Lewis valued and the things that she wanted to do, learn alongside her students, enjoy herself while she's teaching, the students weren't particularly taken up by it. She likes learning new stuff. This seemed bizarre for Jack, the way he was talking about it and the expression and the tone of his voice. So overall, I think that informal learning did not fit into the student schema of how a teacher should be within the wider school ecology, according to some of these students within her school. So a brief discussion about this. I think that overall, through the observations, interviews, and looking at the documents, Miss Lewis did indeed implement the role of the teacher about how Green laid out it should be. So setting the rules at the beginning and then letting students choose who they're working with, have a choice of music, what they were learning to a certain extent. This was cat, depending on what Miss Lewis felt suitable, but there was an element of choice there. There were combined elements of components of music, such as performance, listening, composing. And there were certainly haphazard moments in the lesson, particularly when students were engaging with group work. So I think that yes, Miss Lewis did largely engage with the principles of green theory throughout the lessons at various points. By doing so, she had taken an increased risk. So she was going against the expectation of the teacher as expert figure while she was exercising her agency to implement this pedagogy within her discursive gaps. So she was really saying, I don't know, I would love to learn from you. And she was really emphasising this point that the students should be experts. So this was a risk in her practice, I felt. So I think by doing this, she did set aside her sacred, powerful knowledge on the surface. Of course, she didn't actually use this because this was going around with her all the time. And you could see by the way she taught and the way she helped certain students that, of course, she was an expert. But they didn't see this explicitly because she wasn't teaching them. She wasn't standing at the front with a PowerPoint and teaching them didactically. She was going around and really encouraging the students to flourish in order to break down some hierarchy between the teacher and student. However, this was not wholly welcomed by her students because they just felt it was really different to what the other teachers were doing. And they said that the other teachers knew what they were doing, implying that perhaps she didn't. A potential solution around this concept of teacher expert was proposed by Narita. And she said that teachers could actually project their expert knowledge through demonstration of their musicianship. So instead of talking about this and saying that these are the facts, that perhaps to bring the teacher's instruments into the classroom and to play something for the students so they could see that this implicit sense of musicianship actually hadn't disappeared. It was just being shown in a different way. However, there's a tension here, I feel, that Miss Lewis's instrument was the flute. And Green's original research was based upon how popular musicians learned. And Green, of course, doesn't mention anything about it. It has to be on this instrument. There was no rules at all. However, popular music is largely based upon electric guitars, drums, vocals, and so on. So the flute didn't really fit with the music that the students were choosing to bring into the classroom and they were choosing to learn. I didn't see Miss Lewis bring her flute into lessons or play it at all. And one possible reason could be that, could be another reason at all, but perhaps there was a tension because the flute didn't actually fit with the genre of popular music. So that's something about Miss Lewis's own training and this approach perhaps. So in conclusion, I found that by adopting an informal learning approach in an attempt to solve the existing problems of school music, new ones had in fact been created for Miss Lewis. She did not necessarily fill the student expectation of the teacher as expert figure. This resulted in some negative student perceptions, and it was also found that there was some difference between the wider school ecology and the informal learning pedagogy. So some implications for teachers here. Firstly, I think perhaps one possible solution would be a need to develop student confidence in fulfilling this expert role. So the teacher has handed over their expertise to students potentially, but students need to develop and to be confident in taking on this role and know that actually they do have some knowledge and they are capable of finding out. And yes, of course, the teacher can learn alongside them. Also, there's the concept of perhaps the teacher showing their musicianship by playing in the classroom, by playing alongside students on their instrument. Another potential implication is for increased dialogue to happen with students. So for Miss Lewis to have perhaps, or other teachers perhaps, to have talked to their students about why they're implementing a certain pedagogy and the reason behind this and what students should perhaps benefit from this. This is not something that became clear from students. They didn't know why all this was happening. They just saw it as face value. Thirdly, there could be a consideration of the wider school ecology. So how could informal learning fit within the fabric of a formal traditional school situation? How could things like assessment and accountability be slightly altered to fit informal learning pedagogy and the results that produces? Also, for teachers wanting to implement informal learning pedagogy and who feel passionate about it, perhaps to closely consider the school that they're based within as well to see where they can flourish. So here are the references for the presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope it's provoked some thought and insight about informal learning and a notion of teacher expertise by looking at the case of Miss Lewis. Thank you.